Imagine dragging a double-decker London bus to the top of St. Paul's Cathedral. Now imagine doing that 2.5 million times in the blazing Egyptian sun.
Which is just an exhausting thought.
Right. I mean, for centuries, we thought we knew the story of how the Great Pyramid of Giza was built. We assumed it was constructed by these endless armies of enslaved people, or maybe extraterrestrial intervention, or guided by some mystical celestial alignments.
Yeah, the theories are definitely out there.
They really are. But today's deep dive is going to shatter those preconceptions for you. We have this really fascinating stack of sources in front of us today. We've got comprehensive archaeological overviews, a great piece from BBC Science Focus, and this highly detailed, cutting-edge architectural paper by Simon Andreas Schering.
It's a fantastic stack. We're really tearing up the traditional textbook today.
Exactly. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore the actual architectural methods used. We're focusing heavily on the labor processes, how they transported the stones, and honestly, we're going to contrast the wildly different views of ancient authors regarding why the pyramid was even built in the first place.
Because it really is the ultimate historical puzzle. And, what makes our source material so compelling today is that it forces us to look past all that mythology we've just grown so comfortable with.
Yeah.
Like, the closer we analyze the actual physics alongside the historical texts, the more the traditional answers they start to fracture. We have to reconsider everything we thought we knew about human ingenuity.
So to understand the modern physics of it all, I feel like we first need to look at the ancient gossip. Because the earliest historical accounts of the construction didn't actually emerge until centuries, literally millennia after the final stone was laid.
Right, precisely.
Mm-hmm.
The people writing about it were essentially playing this multi-generational game of historical telephone.
Like Herodotus, right?
Yes, exactly. Take the Greek historian Herodotus. He's writing in the 5th century BC, and he visits Egypt roughly 2,000 years after the pyramid was completed.
2,000 years, that's a massive gap.
It's huge.
Yeah.
And according to his account, a tyrant king named Khufu oppressed like 100,000 laborers to build it. Herodotus wrote that they used these wooden machines to heave the blocks up tier by tier.
I was reading that section of the source material, and it instantly reminded me of a modern card jack.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, instead of rolling a stone up a smooth ramp, Herodotus is describing a system where you have these wooden levers and a team of workers ratchets a massive stone up, one agonizing inch at a time. You secure it, and then you just ratchet it again.
It is a very apt mechanical comparison. It envisions this really slow, segmented vertical lift. And Herodotus also famously noted that there were inscriptions on the pyramid detailing how much the workers spent on radishes, onions, and garlic.
Which is such a weird detail to include.
I know. It adds this bizarrely mundane layer to such a massive undertaking. But, the narrative starts to shift as we move forward in time.
Right, because later historians completely disagreed.
Exactly. A few centuries later, around the 1st century BC, another Greek historian, Diodorus Siculus, evaluates the site, and he dismisses the wooden lever machines entirely. He argues instead that they used massive earthen ramps.
But Diodorus also introduces this bizarre twist about the pyramid's actual purpose, right? He claims the pyramid wasn't even a tomb at all.
Correct. He wrote that the pharaohs were absolutely terrified that this exploited, enslaved workforce would seek revenge and basically desecrate their bodies.
Wow.
So according to Diodorus, the kings were actually buried in secret, far away from these giant monuments.
So to him, the Great Pyramid is practically a monument to, labor disputes and royal paranoia.
Basically, yeah.
It's fascinating how the anxieties of the historian's own era, class warfare and rebellion, just bleed into their interpretation of the past.
And that pattern only intensifies. If you move into the 1st century AD with the Roman writer Pliny the Elder, he had some incredibly strange logistical theories.
Oh, the salt ramps. I remember this.
Yes. He suggested the construction ramps were made of salt and niter. And once the pyramid was finished, he claimed the Egyptians simply diverted the Nile River to melt the ramps away.
Which completely ignores the sheer volume of water you'd need to melt a ramp large enough to build a 146-meter pyramid.
Let alone the environmental devastation of flooding the Giza Plateau with salt water.
Right, it would ruin the land. But Pliny's theory on the purpose of the pyramid is even more telling. He theorized it was either a massive vault to hide the pharaoh's wealth from rivals, or, and this is my favorite, a giant make-work project to keep the lower classes occupied so they wouldn't rebel.
It's such a classic Roman political framework. The idea of giving the plebs massive infrastructure projects to keep them busy and compliant just applied backwards to ancient Egypt.
Yeah, I highly doubt King Khufu was worried about passing an infrastructure and jobs bill to boost his poll numbers.
Definitely not.
And then, by the Middle Ages, the narrative shifted entirely again. People started widely believing the pyramids were Joseph's granaries, from the biblical story in Genesis, built to store grain for a famine.
Which, architecturally speaking, makes zero sense given that they are almost entirely solid stone. There's very little hollow space inside.
Barely any room for grain.
Exactly. But it highlights how desperate people were to assign a rational, utilitarian purpose to something so overwhelmingly massive they just couldn't fathom it was just a monument.
So the ancient historians were essentially taking wild guesses based on their own cultural biases.
Pretty much.
And the biggest things they got wrong, according to our modern archaeological sources, were the slavery myth, the melted salt ramps, and basically all of their theories about the purpose. If we strip away all that mythology, we are left with the hard reality of stone and sweat.
And to grasp that reality, we have to truly understand the scale of what we are looking at. I mean, we are talking about roughly 2.3 million stone blocks.
That number is just hard to wrap your head around.
It is. The average core block weighs 2.5 tons, but many are much heavier, ranging up to 15 tons. And then you have the granite blocks used for the king's chamber. Those were brought all the way from Aswan, and they weigh up to 60 tons each.
Getting back to that London bus metaphor, that is dragging a multi-ton object millions of times.
Right.
And we actually have a textual record of how this process started, which I found to be one of the most compelling pieces of the source material. The Diary of Merer.
Yes, the Diary of Merer. Discovered in 2013, and it is an absolute game changer for Egyptology.
It really is.
Basically, a daily logbook from an ancient Egyptian official detailing the exact logistics of the operation. Merer describes how high-quality white limestone, specifically used for the smooth outer casing of the pyramid, was extracted from the Torah quarries.
And he logged the shipping routes, right?
He did. He meticulously logged how it was transported to Giza by boats navigating a complex series of artificial canals connected to the Nile.
It gives us a window into the actual laborers, because we know now it wasn't the enslaved masses that Herodotus talked about.
No, the slavery narrative has been completely debunked by modern archaeology.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, this was actually a highly organized workforce of skilled laborers, supplemented by conscripts paying their taxes to the state through their labor. During the inundation season, when the Nile flooded the fields and farming was impossible, citizens were conscripted to work on the pyramid.
So it was a functioning civil society project. The sources mention a peak workforce of roughly 14,000 to 40,000 people, organized into these specialized gangs. They were even given gang names, like the Drunks of Menkar.
Which is amazing.
It is. And they were paid in daily rations of high-quality bread and beer. But logistics and administration aside, we have to talk about the physical extraction. How do you actually get a 2.5-ton block out of a solid rock quarry without iron tools?
It's fascinating. The method was incredibly clever and relied entirely on the basic physics of their environment. Workers would carve narrow, natural grooves into the bedrock using copper tools and stone pounders.
Just copper and stone.
Yep. Then they hammered dry wooden wedges deep into those grooves.
Right.
And finally, they soaked the wooden wedges with water.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. As the wood absorbed the water, it expanded with immense, relentless force, and it would crack the rock perfectly along the intended line.
No heavy machinery, just wood, water, and time.
Exactly.
And once they freed the block, they didn't use wheels to move it over land. They placed these blocks on wooden sledges. To solve the massive friction problem of dragging heavy wood over loose sand, they used water again, right? Workers would walk directly in front of the sledge, pouring water onto the sand.
It's a brilliant application of physics. Wet sand has a completely different structural integrity than dry sand. The water creates these microscopic capillary bridges between the sand grains, stiffening the surface.
So it stops the sand from piling up.
Precisely. It prevents the sand from piling up in front of the sledge in a wave, effectively halving the pulling force required.
Okay.
But it was an exact science. Too little water and the sand piles up. Too much water and you create mud, which just increases the friction again.
It makes perfect sense on flat ground. You get a highly organized gang of workers, you wet the sand to the perfect consistency, and you pull.
Right.
But here is the multi-million-ton question that the sources force us to confront. Water and sledges work horizontally. How on earth do you drag a double-decker bus up into the sky?
That exact question has been the primary headache for Egyptologists for over a century. The standard answer, kind of echoing Diodorus, has always been ramps.
Right, the earthen ramps.
But if you actually calculate the math and the physics of traditional external ramps, the concept quickly becomes an engineering nightmare.
I ran the numbers from our sources, and the geometry is staggering. To pull a 2.5-ton block up a ramp using human power, the incline has to be relatively gentle. For a standard 10% slope to reach the top of a 146-meter-tall pyramid, you would need a single straight ramp 1.5 kilometers long.
Exactly. A ramp of that size would require more material than the Great Pyramid itself.
That's insane.
It is. The construction of the ramp would be a more massive undertaking than the monument it was actually meant to build.
Some theories suggest a spiral ramp instead, winding around the pyramid like a road up a mountain. And that solves the length issue, but it seems to create a fatal logistical flaw at every single corner.
The corners are precisely where the spiral ramp theory breaks down. Picture a massive block on a wooden sledge, pulled by dozens of men on long ropes. When you hit a 90-degree corner on a narrow, elevated spiral ramp, everyone has to stop.
Because the ropes lose tension.
Exactly, the ropes go slack. You have to pivot a multi-ton block on a dime in a very confined space. It creates massive traffic jams. Keep in mind, to finish the pyramid within Khufu's roughly 20 to 27-year reign, workers had to place about one block every single minute of the working day.
One block every minute.
Yeah, you cannot maintain a one block per minute pace if your entire workforce is constantly stalled at corner bottlenecks.
But our sources do mention a relatively recent breakthrough that complicates the ramp debate. The BBC article highlighted the Hatnub discovery.
Oh yes, in 2018, researchers at the Hatnub Alabaster Quarry made a startling discovery. They found a ramp cut directly into the rock with an extreme 20% slope.
20%? That's incredibly steep.
Very steep. But what made it special was that it was flanked by staircases and featured distinct wooden post holes.
So how did those post holes actually function mechanically?
They acted as a force-multiplying pulley system.
Yeah.
Ropes were tied to the sledge carrying the stone block, and these ropes were passed around massive wooden posts securely driven into the holes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this allowed teams of workers walking down the stairs to pull the block up the ramp. By utilizing the post to redirect the force and using the weight of the workers moving downward, they could haul heavy stones up much steeper inclines than we previously thought possible.
Okay, it's a brilliant find for a quarry. But we have to be critical here. A 20% slope is steep, sure, but a 146-meter-tall pyramid is an entirely different beast than a quarry ramp. Plus, we come back to Diodorus' observation that the ramps vanished without a trace. If there were massive 20% exterior ramps zigzagging up the Great Pyramid or winding around it, where is the archaeological evidence at Giza? I mean, you don't just misplace millions of tons of ramp material.
That is the million-dollar question. The complete lack of exterior archaeological evidence, combined with the sheer physical limits of hauling stone up the outside of the structure, brings us to the most radical part of our deep dive.
The Schering paper.
Yes. The architectural paper by Simon Andreas Schering essentially throws out the idea of massive external construction ramps entirely.
Schering's proposal is that the odd internal architecture of the pyramid, these bizarre rooms and corridors that have confused explorers for centuries, they weren't just hallways for a funeral procession. The Grand Gallery, the ascending passage, the descending passage, he argues these were actually internal sliding ramps.
Yes, the construction machine was inside the pyramid all along.
Which is just mind-bending.
It really is.
Yeah.
He suggests the Great Pyramid itself was a gravity-powered construction engine. And the heart of this engine is a space known as the antechamber.
Because for 200 years, Egyptologists assumed the antechamber was just a primitive portcullis, basically a security room where heavy granite gates were dropped to crush or block tomb robbers.
Right.
But if you look at Schering's paper, he points out that the masonry in this room is far too rough and industrial to be a finished ceremonial architectural space. He believes it was actually a massive granite pulley system.
In Schering's model, heavy ropes were slung over lubricated wooden logs that were locked directly into the granite walls of the antechamber.
Let's unpack that for a second and trace the mechanics of how this engine actually fires, because it relies on those internal passages. The Grand Gallery is built at a very specific 26.5-degree angle. Schering claims workers would load a 2.3-ton granite counterweight onto a sledge.
Right.
And they send that counterweight sliding down the lubricated slope of the Grand Gallery.
And here is where the physics do the work. Gravity pulls the heavy sledge down the internal ramp. That downward force pulls the ropes over the antechamber pulley logs, hoisting the heavy construction blocks up the outside of the pyramid.
It's essentially a modern elevator system.
Exactly like an elevator.
The heavy counterweight falls down the shaft, effortlessly pulling the elevator car up.
But hold on. This is where the physics and Schuring's paper require a bit more scrutiny for me.
Okay, let's hear it.
If gravity pulls the 2.3-ton counterweight down to the bottom of the Grand Gallery, how are they getting it back up to do the next block? Aren't they just creating a new ramp problem inside a cramped 4-foot-wide tunnel?
That is the critical mechanical question, and Schuring's paper does address this. The key is the difference in load and the use of secondary rope systems.
Okay.
See, when the counterweight goes down, it is pulling a massive construction block up the exterior. But once that exterior block is detached at the top, the counterweight at the bottom of the gallery is no longer fighting a multi-ton load. Ah, so resetting the machine is entirely different from firing it.
Exactly. To reset the counterweight, a smaller team of workers situated at the top of the Grand Gallery would use a secondary rope system to haul the sledge back up the 26.5-degree slope.
Because it's empty.
Right. Because they are only pulling the 2.3-ton sledge itself and utilizing the heavily lubricated tracks of the gallery. It requires a fraction of the workforce needed to hoist a raw block up the unlubricated exterior. They reset the counterweight, attach the next exterior block to the main ropes, and let gravity do the heavy lifting all over again.
That is just ruthless efficiency. You completely eliminate the need for a 1.5-kilometer external ramp because gravity is your primary workforce. You just reset the system and repeat.
Yeah.
But even with the counterweight reset explained, I still have a major logistical pushback.
What's that?
If the sliding ramps and the pulleys are all functioning on the inside, how did they build the smooth, flat outside of the pyramid? Wouldn't the massive ropes running from the internal antechamber to the exterior continually be in the way of the blocks they were laying?
That is an excellent observation.
Yeah.
And to answer it, Schuring points directly to the exterior of the pyramid. Because if you examine the core of the pyramid, stripping away the smooth white casing stones that originally covered it, the structure isn't perfectly uniform.
Okay.
It is covered in what Schuring identifies as structural scars.
Right, the physical footprint of the theory. The paper details how the layers of the courses shrink as the pyramid gets taller.
Yes.
In a traditional ramp model, you'd expect those blocks to just gradually get smaller in a smooth, continuous gradient as you move up. But they don't. They shrink in distinct bins or steps.
These bins are highly specific. You'll find a vertical section of large blocks, then an abrupt transition to a section of medium blocks, then suddenly smaller ones.
Which is so odd.
Very odd. But Schuring argues that these distinct bins match the exact placement of where peripheral pulley stations would have been anchored on the outside of the pyramid, linked back to the internal sliding ramps. The stones literally change size based on the mechanical limits and the leverage of the pulley station working that specific vertical section.
But what about the ropes interfering with the flat faces of the pyramid?
This is perhaps the most revealing detail of all. From the ground, the four faces of the Great Pyramid look perfectly flat. But high-resolution laser scanning reveals they're actually slightly concave. They bow inward.
Really?
Yeah. Furthermore, running right down the middle of each of the four faces is a visible indentation, known as a central furrow.
A vertical channel right down the center.
Exactly.
Under Schuring's model, that makes perfect sense. Because the ropes were running up the middle of the face, pulling the blocks, the workers couldn't build straight across in horizontal lines. They had to build from the outer corners inward toward the ropes.
Exactly. They leave a vertical channel open in the middle for the ropes and the blocks to travel up.
It's like zipping up a jacket from the bottom to the top. The workers are laying blocks from the edges, moving inward, leaving the zipper track open in the middle, and then once that entire vertical section is complete, they have to do the final zip up.
Precisely. They finally fill in the gap where the pulley ropes operated. But because they were placing those final center blocks in such tight confines at the very end of the phase, the alignment was imperfect.
Which leaves the scar.
Exactly. It left a slight concavity, a noticeable vertical seam.
That central furrow is literally the fossilized footprint of the construction machine. We've looked at this concavity for centuries as just wear and tear, settling stone, but it's actually the track of the elevator.
It is.
The smooth white casing stones they added at the very end just hid all these mechanical imperfections from the world.
It completely reframes how we view the structure. It ceases to be just a static tomb. The building itself was a kinetic machine that built itself.
Let's bring this all together for you listening. We started this deep dive with ancient historians playing a 2,000-year-old game of telephone.
Guessing about tyrants, massive slave REs, and absurd ramps made of salt simply because they couldn't fathom the logistics.
Then we looked at the hard archaeological evidence, revealing the incredible reality. Tens of thousands of skilled, tax-paying citizens moving mountains of stone on wet sand, fueled by a well-organized state economy and utilizing the natural physics of wood and water.
And finally, we explored Schöring's radical architectural theory. We moved past the impossible math of external ramps and uncovered the possibility that the Great Pyramid was a giant, physics-defying mechanical elevator engine.
It used gravity, counterweights, and internal sliding ramps to pull itself into the sky, leaving the scars of its own creation hidden right on its face.
It really is a testament to human ingenuity. It forces us to look past our modern biases and appreciate the sheer, rigorous engineering brilliance of the ancient world.
It absolutely does. And I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder today. For centuries, explorers, historians, and mystics have crawled through the Great Pyramid. They looked at the strange, steep 26.5-degree angle of the Grand Gallery. They looked at the weirdly positioned grooves in the antechamber.
And they assumed these things held deep, magical, or celestial meaning.
Right. But what if the profound mystery of the Great Pyramid isn't magic? What if it isn't religion or aliens? What if it's just ruthless, brilliant, pragmatic engineering?
It raises a fascinating question. What other ancient mysteries have we over-spiritualized simply because we didn't understand the math?
Exactly. Keep asking questions and keep viewing the world through a new lens. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.